So thank you again.
Great. So just to get started, why don't we have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll go a little bit more in depth for maybe those who aren't familiar with all of the amazing work you lead before we go into the panel discussion. I guess I can start as I'm moderating the panel. Hi, my name is Kavitha Rai. I am a sophomore at USC studying public policy and law, and I'm really excited to help be facilitating the conversation today.
Hi, my name is Navyug Gill. I'm a historian. I teach at Patterson University.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Manpreet Kalra. I am a social impact advisor working and specializing in global development.
Hi, my name is Sukhman Dhami. I'm the co-founder of Ensaaf, which is a human rights organization that's dedicated to investigating gross human rights violations in India with a special focus on Punjab.
Amazing. And just to go a little bit in depth about our panelists, Navyug is currently completing a book manuscript on caste politics and the emergence of peasant in colonial Punjab. His academic and popular writings have appeared in venues such as Journal of Asian Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, Outlook, Law and Political Economy Project, and Trolley Times. Manpreet is a social impact advisor, as she mentioned, and she navigates the intersection of impact communication and sustainable global development. Her activism focuses on the interconnectivity of economic, social, and climate justice. She educates using a variety of mediums, including the Art of Citizenry podcast, where she shares her nuanced and unfiltered insights on building a more just and equitable future. Sukhman is the co-founder and co-director of Ensaaf, a human rights organization that works to end impunity and achieve justice for crimes against humanity in India. And he was a recipient of the 2004 Unity Award from the San Francisco Coalition of Minority Bars and South Asian Bar Association for his outstanding service for the legal community. He's published in several articles and reports on he has published several articles and reports on human rights in India with The Hill, Christian Science Monitor, and Human Rights Watch. Great. Virtual round of applause for our panelists and their amazing wealth of knowledge. Yeah, so just to go right into it, because again, there's so much to really unpack, and I know everyone is eager to hear from our panelists. A rundown of the event is we will go through for about 40 minutes a panel discussion, and then there will be time for the audience to engage in a Q&A within the last 20 to 15 minutes. So yeah, to orient this panel, we're thinking of breaking it off into structures, and to go right off the bat, I really want to talk about what are these agriculture bills and the context behind what we need to know to understand the farmer protests in India right now. And so I'll be throwing out questions. Not every one of the panelists needs to answer all three, but you guys can figure out who wants to answer what and what makes most sense. So first question being, what exactly are the three bills that were passed, and what do they mean for farmers?
Should I take that, I guess? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
First, just a quick, thanks to Kavitha and Mia and everyone else at USC for putting on this event. And I'm really delighted to share the panel with Manpreet and Sukhman, and so happy that all of you could join. I really wish we could have been in the same room together, but I guess this electronic relationship will have to do. So yes, the three laws, I think there's been a lot written about this issue, but it's worth kind of giving the sort of backdrop and some of the content of these laws. We should remember that they were promulgated in the middle of a pandemic lockdown over the summer. No farmer or laborer union leader was consulted in the drafting of these laws. There was no impending agrarian crisis that necessitated them. And they were passed through a special session of Parliament in September without due process. So what are these laws? The first law allows corporations to buy grain from farmers at fluctuating prices. And what this does is it changes the existing system where farmers would sell their grain to government procurement markets called mandis at minimum support prices, or MSP. The second law allows corporations to stockpile grain in unlimited quantities, so they can buy when the prices are low and hold them and then sell when high. Previously, there were limits on stockpiling and hoarding and speculation to prevent this kind of thing. And the third law allows corporations to enter into lopsided agreements with farmers for growing crops. Before, this was not allowed because a contract presupposes two equal parties and there can be no quality between a farmer and an Ambani. So together, this kind of sounds benign in the sense that there's kind of freedom and choice, but what it actually means is these three laws will deregulate and privatize the agrarian sector. And that will result in dismantling the public distribution system, which is the way the government has subsidized grain to sell to something like 40 to 60% of the Indian population at subsidized rates. And it will devastate the livelihoods of millions of people and have wider repercussions to tens and even hundreds of millions. I think what's key to understanding these laws is that these are not agricultural reforms. This is something we hear over and over again. These are not reforms. People in Punjab have been demanding reforms for 5 decades. These laws will do nothing about the structural problems in the agrarian sector. So we have problems of monocropping of rice and wheat. We have problems of chemical dependence on fertilizers and pesticides. We have a sinking water table, farmer suicides, land inequity. These laws do nothing about those issues. They are a corporate handover that will enrich private interests to the immiseration and volatility of everyone else. And that is why farmer and labor unions from the summer have been mobilizing against them.
And I think one of the things, just going off of what you said, that's really important to note is that these laws are not just going to impact small farmers and farm workers. These are going to impact the citizens of India. Because what we see when we think about stockpiling of commodities is you have these private players that can essentially hoard and control the cost of crops like wheat and paddy, right? Paddy is rice before it's husked. And it's really important to recognize that these bills, there's been a focus on the fact that it is small farmers that are going to see that immediate impact, but it's also going to be the greater population, because what we're going to see is now with private players being able to control access to some of these crops, they're able to control the price. They're able to increase the price that people are paying because there will be an increase of demand. And so at the end of the day, what we're seeing is truly all that is wrong with capitalism at its finest, where you have exploitation of those at the bottom of the chain, and only those who are at the top are basically able to hoard wealth, right? So when we talk about wealth distribution, India already has a lot of economic disparities at play. And we're seeing those economic disparities continue to be, continue to manifest through these laws.
Right, and we know obviously farmers have been voicing their concerns, they privately and publicly, and what are some of the Indian government's response, and where are the bills right now as far as the status? Has there been any progress at all?
The bills, the status is that the Indian government, the moment they announced these bills, like I said, there was massive opposition. The farmer and labor unions started a mobilization campaign. It entailed, marches and demonstrations, public meetings. They printed out leaflets and distributed them amongst people so that everyone could get educated about these bills. So throughout the summer, in the middle of the pandemic, they did all of this and the government completely ignored them. Wouldn't broke any dissent, any question about these bills. When they were passed through in September, in the face of mounting opposition, there was still sort of no regard of people's aspirations and demands. The movement escalated in the fall. There was a blockading of railway lines. There was shutting down of toll plazas. There was demonstrations in front of petrol pumps and malls surrounding the homes of politicians. It had no effect on the government whatsoever. And then finally, at the end of November, we saw those incredible scenes of people pushing past water cannons and tear gas canisters and barricades to march on the capital, New Delhi, because the government wasn't willing to hear their voice throughout all of these months of organizing and activism. They felt the need to take the argument to the central government in Delhi. They did that at the end of November. They stopped on the outskirts and set up these makeshift encampments. The numbers swelled into the hundreds of thousands. And regardless, the government still refused to budge on these bills. And all the while hurling all sorts of accusations against the protesters. So from the notion that these people are just uninformed, that they don't understand these bills, to the fact that these are just rich farmers that are going to complain, to the fact that these are terrorists, these are communists, these are separatists, all sorts of kind of slander. And it shows the arrogance of the government. It shows its kind of colonial mentality of thinking that these people are too stupid to know their own interests. And it shows their refusal to engage in a kind of democratic process where a certain region of people are going to be devastated by these changes and they have actually no say in their lives and in their economy. And I think that's the kind of central sort of tension. On the other hand, the farmers have been steadfast in their resistance. And they have actually broadened this movement to incorporate all sorts of different diverse groups of people in society across India. And so the pressure is mounting because it has become a popular struggle against neoliberal Hindutva authoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I want everyone to understand that these bills have been passed. They are in effect, right? Like this, now what the protests we're seeing, it's about repealing the bills. And so understanding that is really important. The other thing, and I think Navyug, you said this earlier, is when we talk about sustainable global development, we have to recognize that you can only create true change and you can really dismantle systems if you have the people who are being most affected by the issue at the decision-making table. And that is not happening, right? And we're seeing that the people are voicing their opinions, and yet their opinions are not being taken into any consideration. The other thing that I think is also important is that what we're seeing with like the MSP, the minimum support price, is not new, right? Like, so there's a case study of Bihar that people have been talking about, right? So I believe it's 2006, Nitish Kumar, who's the chief minister of Bihar, essentially said, we are going to get rid of MSP. And what we've seen is that now a lot of, the wheat and paddy in Bihar is being sold at less than half of what the MSP used to be. And so many of the small farmers and farm workers in Bihar have had to abandon their land and are now laborers in farming in Punjab. And so we have to understand that this is proven. We already know what is to come of these bills. This isn't new. We have a micro case study in India itself. And one of the arguments that you often hear right now is, well, why are people in the diaspora so up in arms about these bills? Your own agricultural industry is very similar to this. And it's really important to recognize that agribusiness in the United States is not great, right? Like small farmers are suffering here as well. But B, it's also important to recognize that the same cookie cutter approach cannot work in every country. You have to take into account cultural, political norms that really play a role in that country's ethos. And so those are all aspects that we have to think about when we're really talking about the bills, but also what the current state of affairs are and where we go from here.
You know, I wanted to add that, you know, it's clear and by all accounts that the response of protesters have been almost entirely peaceful, and they've been exercising, you know, their legitimate international rights to assembly and speech. Yet these basic norms have been consistently attacked, and we've seen that through the entire time of Modi's administration. And to, you know, paraphrase from, you know, Arundhati Roy, and, you know, forgive me if I'm misquoting her, but she said, and this was in the context of the Narmada Dam protests, which have, you know, that movement has been going on, you know, for well over a decade. And what she had said was to the effect that when you do not honor a peaceful dissent, when you do not honor popular broad-based movements, the message that you are communicating is that you only honor violence. Mm-hmm. And that is increasingly the response that we're seeing from Indian security forces, the rhetoric of the Indian government, the BJP and their supporters. You know, security forces have amassed around the protest sites, and these are not just, you know, Delhi police. We're also talking about paramilitary forces, the Border Security Force, the Central Reserve Police Force. And we know in the past, you know, particularly in the Punjab context, that when there was a broad-based popular movement in the 80s protesting issues of state rights, protesting issues of the denuding of the state's natural water resources, that the state was just waiting for an excuse to be able to respond to this, what had been a broad-based peaceful movement, with extreme violence. And so I think, you know, what's alarming and what's so important to pay attention to is how the state has responded in other broad-based popular movements that implicate natural resources, that implicate the agricultural community, that implicate, you know, the destruction of the livelihoods of the poor. And there's ample precedent to show that the government is willing to just railroad through their policies, as they have, you know, done yet again.
Right, and I think that brings us to the next point that I wanted to kind of talk about, is this idea of India as the most populous democracy in the world. What is the state of democracy truly in India, and how do you combat state violence that doesn't lead to potential, you know, more danger against the frontliners and those even within the diaspora who have been vocal about this? How do you, where do you go from here? And is this considered a turning point within the, within considering India as a democratic state?
I think that there was, maybe one of the other panelists looked into this, but I saw it fleeting in one of my feeds. There was a recent article about naming India a partially democratic country. I do not know more context on that, but I think that, and if someone else does, please jump in. But I think it's really important to recognize that the human rights violations we are seeing during these protests are not new. They have existed historically. And, you know, I mean, we also have to recognize, like, these similar police brutality is not something that's just unique to India. We see it here in the United States. We have to recognize that, like, a lot of these issues, I think that sometimes it's easy to get fixated when they're farther away from home, but we have to recognize they happen close to home as well for so many communities. But with that said, in the context of India, it's important to recognize, you know, all, you know, this idea of people who are dissenting being disappeared, being unlawfully imprisoned, this idea of police being incredibly brutal, of rape being used as a, and I apologize, I should have used a trigger warning, but rape being used as a tool to suppress dissent. Like, all of these things have happened throughout history. None of this is new. It's just that now we're seeing all these factors. We have the X factor of social media. We have the X factor of information being much more accessible, of cameras, of phones, and all of that stuff. But this has happened throughout history. And this goes back so much further. And to, we need to recognize that Punjab has had historically and continues to have a very contentious relationship with the central government. And there's multiple factors around that. And it goes back to even the time of like the British leaving India and even potentially before that. But we have to recognize that all of these forms of human rights violations and the fact of, for so many of us, I think we can, I feel, I'm not trying to speak for my fellow panelists, but I think we can all agree that none of these actions are a surprise to any of us. We've seen this play out. It is the reality of India's democracy. And we have always, and we see this, Modi in particular is a very autocratic leader, right? And so we are seeing how that plays out and how that plays out with power, because there has always been power structures and power struggles. May those be based on religious supremacy, caste-based supremacy, and so forth. So I think it's really important to recognize that.
You want to add something, or should I?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question, and because this slogan of the world's largest democracy gets bandied about all the time. I don't think you can read an op-ed or a kind of, reporting on India without them sort of mentioning this. And I think it's one of those things we have to look at very critically. And I think there's two levels to it. On the one hand, formal democracy, in the sense of periodic elections every 3 or 4 or 5 years. It might seem like India has had periodic elections. Now, if you look at a place like Punjab, for the first 40 or 50 years post-independence, the Congress government under Nehru and then later Indira Gandhi did everything in their power to undermine, subvert, and sabotage democratic expression. Anytime there was a non-Congress government that tried to kind of have an alternative, they either coerced them into sort of collapsing. They either bought off members, they threw people in jail, or they declared president's rule. So it hasn't been much of a democracy in Punjab, even formally. Now, if you look at substantively, is democracy just periodic elections? What does actually democratic culture mean? What does it mean for everybody to have a say and to sort of participate and be part of a larger society? If you look at India from that perspective, has it been a democracy for Dalits, which are something like 300 or 400 million people? Mm-hmm. Has it been a democracy for Adivasis? Has it been a democracy for Kashmiris who've lived under brutal military occupation for decades now? Has it been a democracy for women? 51% of the population, and we see the horrific levels of violence and marginalization and exclusion. So actually, on a formal level, I think the credentials are a sham. But I think substantively, there's no hope at all. And I think part of naming it as a kind of undemocratic society is the desire to build a democratic culture. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a matter of kind of critiquing it. One can critique a government and still be invested in trying to transform that society. So, and I think that's part of our struggle in America, right? What did we just go through? What are we still going through? We don't feel like it's much of a democratic country. The government doesn't represent the people, but we are still part of this society. So I think that's part of what we have to kind of interrogate when we look at the question of India and democracy.
And I would add that, India can never become a democracy until it ends the war on its own people. We've spoken about, Punjab and how there was, over a decade of enforced disappearances and unlawful killings and a widespread systematic campaign of torture. And, sadly, that was not unique to Punjab. over half of India's states, and then of course, occupied territories like Kashmir have experienced outright insurgency or civil unrest, and the state has responded in all these territories, whether you're talking about, the states in the Northeast, whether you're talking about Punjab, whether you're talking about, the area labeled as the Red Belt because of a Maoist insurgency. India has been continuously at war with itself. Even as early as, even even the days before, India, won its independence from the British, they actually began an aerial bombarding campaign against the Nagas. So this propensity and willingness to kind of, attack its own body has really, prevented democratic culture from emerging in India, and also, to speak to the earlier point, democratic process. Because in all these regions where India is engaged in counterinsurgency, violent counterinsurgency, very often the state legislative assemblies are dismissed. Central government has imposed direct rule, so you actually don't even have the facade of a process democracy, let alone kind of the substantive notions of creating a culture of democracy. And then obviously Modi and the BJP, they've actively promoted values that are antithetical to a culture of democracy, right? This notion of Hinduvata, that India is first and foremost a place for a very particular type of Hinduism, is kind of really strikes against one of the cherished aspects of democracy, which is pluralism, and moreover ensuring that the most vulnerable and minorities have equal protections, if not greater protections. And I think these farm laws are just a continuation of the authoritarianism that we've seen accelerated under the Modi administration. But certainly this is consistent with the trajectory that unfortunately India has been on since its inception.
Right. And so where do other, countries play a role in taking a stance on, especially those who want to have, through very common foreign policy objectives, have alliances with India? Where do you see these, do you think that those foreign policy objectives of wanting to create, strong alliances with India outweigh the potential damages of creating an alliance with a rising autocratic regime, one that has not been democratic?
I'll start by saying that U.S. foreign policy is often wrong, and more often than not, I would say. And this is evident from, obviously the various, offensive, illegal wars that the United States has been involved in. And you can go back decades to even kind of more, recent times. And their foreign policy is also often short-sighted. And it has, the consensus is, and I believe it's been definitively established, that whenever you overlook gross human rights violations, crimes against humanity, genocide, the cost of redressing those abuses is always greater than had you had, the correct policy to begin with, to have, forestalled and prevented that. India is under a genocide alert and warning. It's been labeled as a country that has the potential for, multiple genocides. And for the United States to kind of continue to woo this partnership with India under this, notion that it's a bulwark of democracy in the region is totally false. India has done nothing for democracy in the region. If we look at who is India, like the neighboring states in India, they are not any kind of paradigm for human rights or democracy. And then also it's equally false to think that India is somehow going to be a bulwark against China in a military sense. India has capitulated on every single military conflict with China. India has no ability to withstand any type of military confrontation with China. China is just a few years behind reaching kind of military parity with the United States. So it's an absolute joke for people in this administration, the Biden administration, EU, it doesn't matter which government is, to think that India is going to take the risk of sticking out its neck to kind of help contain China. They're just not going to do it. And at the same time, you know, by catering to this notion that India is somehow a bulwark, either in a military sense or in a sense that is promoting democracy in the region, actually it's a form of silence that is leading to more violence in India. So it's very counterproductive. But at the same time, I think there's a very real opportunity to communicate to this administration and an opportunity to influence this administration. I think they are in the process of forming, their approach to India, and there is a real opportunity to make sure that human rights are centered.
Yeah, and I will say, I think one of the things that's important to recognize is it's unfortunate, but given the state of agribusiness in the United States and the UK, it's really hard to say that any country is going to take a stance on the actual bills themselves, right? Which is, I think, what some of the approaches earlier on around global engagement were. But the human rights aspect is really where I can see international engagement, because as Sukhman was saying, right, like genocide there are stages of genocide that we are actively seeing play out. And the thing about genocide is it's absolutely preventable as long as someone interferes early enough, right? And so that's where I think we see the role of global governments and foreign governments. But it will not be on the bills themselves. It will not be on repealing said bills, but it will be on the human rights aspect. And I think that there's multiple layers to why that is. And I mean, I can also understand that part of the issue is, thinking about global North versus global South power structures. You don't want a country dictating another country's policies. The United States has a history of doing that, and that's one of the things that we think is so fundamentally wrong. However, the human rights aspect, I think, is just very critical for us to recognize that is an opportunity, as Sukhman was saying, for us to see some sort of interference, because India has historically and continues to have human rights violations going unchecked. The fact that genocide is so normalized is incredibly problematic.
Yeah, let me just add, I think I am both sort of less optimistic and then more optimistic at the same time with my panelists. So I'm less optimistic about this administration, but I'm more optimistic in the sense of the potential to exert pressure. So if we look at the bills, it's actually kind of instructive. When this issue sort of entered into kind of Western audiences after November and into December, there was a lot of push to get politicians in the West to make statements. And there was these sort of fitful starts. A few of them sort of started speaking out in the US and in Canada and England and Australia, but let's just stick to the US. And those statements are very revealing if we look at them carefully, because what would happen is a politician would make a statement expressing sort of sympathy for the protest, and then emphasizing the right of people to assemble without fear of violence. And that would be it. They would fall silent after that. There would actually be no discussion of the content of these bills, the content of why people are actually protesting. And the reason why they're silent is because it is a bipartisan US government policy to demand countries in the global South end their subsidies and supports for their citizens while maintaining them for agribusinesses here. So the US is at the hypocritical forefront, using the IMF and the World Bank to demand countries, India, but we can go throughout Africa and Asia and elsewhere, that they end these subsidies. So this is it's not a matter of should the US interfere or not. It is interfering in full support of these bills. So I think what that does for people living here is we ought to go towards those politicians who've made those kind of mealy-mouthed statements about sympathy and the right to protest and demand much more. And say it's not enough to just say people have a right to assemble. what about what this government is pushing down the throats of those countries over there? And I think we can invest much more hope in the labor and civil society organizations in the US that have kind of seen this hypocrisy and have published sort of statements actually backing the struggle on its own terms to repeal these laws. There was a statement a couple of weeks ago where they kind of mentioned that this neoliberal logic has sort of been fully sort of, it's transpired in the US. And now India is actually at the forefront of the fight back. And we lost the battle in the US in some ways, and the battle is now being waged there. So they've made those calls, and I think we ought to strengthen them. And the last thing I'll say is, we in the US ought to learn from this struggle, because what these farmers and laborers have done is see through the dishonesty and euphemisms of their own politicians, right? At the morcha, at the barricade sites, they don't allow politicians to speak from the stage. They have rejected all of the existing political parties. And they're actually against the status quo and demanding a kind of new political order. We here are still kind of lulled into the binary of Republican and Democrat and sort of get caught up in the mess here. So we actually ought to take direction from what people are doing there and rethink what politics is here. So I'm hopeful in that sense.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's important, I know this was something that we were potentially going to talk about at some point, but I know time is of the essence, is we also can't ignore that it is foreign powers that made the Green Revolution happen in India, right? Like the irony of all of this is ridiculous, and it's not lost on any of us, right? So we saw that in the 1960s, the Green Revolution, I want everyone to recognize Green Revolution is not an India-only thing. It actually started in Mexico. It is actively underway in Africa. Like there is, this is a concept that has hit all through South America, and we're seeing, the Green Revolution was taken to India by the Ford Foundation, by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was a US scientist that was leading that. And it was very much to recognize it's incredibly important that we take a moment to recognize that these are also the issues that we're seeing around farmer suicide, the issues that we're seeing around agribusiness in India. And it's the results is truly, we've intervened, and we have to recognize that we've intervened usually, and countries only intervene for their own benefit. And we have to recognize that as well.
And just to add, it's this nexus between U.S. foreign policy and the foundation world has been kind of consistent and persistent. And, the latest iteration of that, I would say, is the Gates Foundation. Last year, they recognized Modi with an award, and, our colleagues, Arjun Sethi and Suchitra from the Polish Project wrote this incredible op-ed calling on, the Gates Foundation to rescind that award. They ultimately didn't. And it's no coincidence that, Gates is a big proponent of GMO agriculture. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know what the, financial, benefits are, but this is something that's certainly, part of that foundation's world vision for whatever, the ends are that they seek. And this is just this is like Green Revolution Part 2, in a sense. And the U.S. government and, private foundations, which are, there's a lot of private wealth that's, behind them as well, that are, kind of pushing these policies and, quote unquote reforms, to countries like India.
Yeah.
And so I think there's also an opportunity there to, challenge these individuals and challenge these foundations.
Yeah. I'm in Seattle. I'm walking distance from the Gates Foundation's Visitor Center, and they have a whole section on high yielding seeds, right? And it's not hidden. It's very evident. And usually the context we hear it around is like, we're helping fight famine, right? We're helping fight famine. So we've created there's these high yielding seeds, and they're going to help fight famine. And I think that this is where it's really important to recognize just because the intention might be one thing doesn't necessarily mean the execution is resulting in great good as well, right? That's what we have to see, is where the results are. And thinking about, I was listening to someone earlier today, and they mentioned something really important, that you know, between Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, they own a lot of land, farming land in the United States, right? So we have to recognize that there's a lot of investment, and we know that, you know, farming is important because that's what allows us to survive as humans. And so it's important to recognize the role that private players already have in the farming industry. None of this is new. We're just now really able to start dissecting these power structures at play.
I feel like we could stay on this for a really long time, but I will shift into one more question that actually incorporates a question that I saw in the chat too before going straight into Q&A, and that is the navigating the international solidarity we see specifically on social media. Social media has helped amplify the farmers' movement, but has also helped amplify hate speech, violence, and we're even seeing censorship of certain organizations and activists, and propaganda, misinformation. And so one, I want to get your guys' commentary on what you think the role big tech has played in controlling the narrative of these protests.
A very active role. You know, I think that short and simple, right? A very active role. I think, Navyug, you mentioned Ambani briefly in passing earlier, and to understand that, right, we've got these two incredibly wealthy families that have have ownership in Facebook, they have ownership in Google. I mean, they've invested in Facebook, invested in Google, and it's important to recognize that money equals power. And they've done a very good job. Like, if you think about how do you regulate narratives and control narratives, you control media, you control the places where people have those narratives play out. And we've seen that happening with the protests. We've seen hashtags getting censored. We have seen, I mean, I myself have received quite a few hate messages, and I know other activists have as well. And I think that that's not uncommon for many of us. And it's a reality that so many of us accepted and accept through the work that we are doing. But it's also incredibly important to recognize that these private players, these companies do in fact regulate what news we see. I mean, we saw this during the election here in the United States, right? Like, the news that we see is often very much catered to us. And it's important to recognize that online is not a safe space for many people. And part of that is that we do have a lot of hate speech that's being circulated. There's a lot of bots and so forth. And I think that it's important to find avenues where you feel that you can get authentic information. I think Kali Times is a great resource for anyone who does want to learn more about what is happening on the ground, because there is a lot of information circulating.
Yeah, I would just I'd add to that. I think it is a kind of it's a messy kind of topic. It's quite complicated. I think that you're right, Kavita, to say that, you know, these sort of social media has kind of amplified the situation on the ground and this struggle. It didn't create it out of the blue, right? So there is a kind of world outside of it. Online activism, we should put a little asterisk. There is activism, and then the online stuff maybe helps it, but it's not in and of itself activism. At least I don't see it as such. But on the one hand, yes, big tech has played a really nefarious role in lining with the Indian government and blocking accounts, actually leading to the arrest of activists, sort of instituting a kind of electronic crackdown on these hashtags and on these other kind of platforms. clamping down on the one hand, and then also kind of facilitating all sorts of right-wing bigotry and hate, as Manpreet was saying. I think on the other side, people have used these technologies despite the interests of big tech. So the kind of CEOs and people in charge might have one intent, but the people on the ground in this struggle have very adeptly used Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. They have a YouTube channel, but they also created their own newspaper, as Manpreet mentioned, Trolley Times on the front line. So they're kind of using it against the grain or in their own interests as well. And then they sort of get cracked down and they kind of sprout up in other ways. I think actually what this question provokes is a more fundamental sort of challenge. And that is, when infrastructure like this becomes so fundamental to the way we interact, should it be held in private hands? Why should a person own something that is now part of how we actually conduct our day-to-day life? There are better ways to organize infrastructure, because that is what these platforms have become. They've become like the phone cables and the highways and the bridges and roads of our world. There's better ways to organize them that will ensure, creative expression and making connections, not sort of in the kind of tyranny of a few shareholders or a few individuals. I think that's the kind of horizon we ought to push for. And there are people doing important work in that direction.
I want to go back to kind of the original question about solidarity. And I think we have to include and expand beyond that and really come to the place of understanding where, their cause is our cause and our causes are their causes. Because even just with respect to this issue of internet freedom and censorship and telecommunication, there's a direct kind of copycatting that you see that India has engaged in based on what the United States has implemented in this country, particularly in the context of international terrorism and domestic terrorism. They come up with these, frameworks and rationales that justify access to communication and data and restricting it for some groups or individuals and not others. And so you see that same rhetoric now being used in India, where these farmers, their supporters, their aiders, Disha Ravi comes to mind, where these individuals are accused of things that threaten the national security of India, and terrorism has certainly been used. Anti-national crimes have certainly been invoked. And these are all justifications that kind of have originated, starting kind of with, the global war on terrorism. And then they went from, global transitioning to targeting, people within our respective countries. And this is working directly against kind of the emerging consensus now that internet access and telecommunications is a fundamental human right. And so a government like India and even the United States, you see this debate occurring in two-speed internet. Like, should there be access to two different speeds? In India, it's even more basic, where they can just shut down the internet altogether at a whim under the most flimsiest of rationales and perceived threats. And so I think this is not so much about solidarity, but really recognizing that the struggle there is our struggle, and them recognizing that our struggles are also their struggles, and internet freedom and telecommunications and access to data and these issues of privacy are emblematic of kind of where we are sharing this struggle.
Right. And just being conscious of time, I also want to now move on to the Q&A session. So If you have a question, as Mia stated in the chat, please raise your hand and we'll go in an order. So I saw Harbani, then Suhas, and then Serena. So we'll go in that order.
Hello, everyone. This is Harbani Kaur. My question is more because I was in India in December, in January. I did participate at the Morcha in the Delhi border. So my question is more of what is the most educated plan, or because I see the panelists are greatly informed. I was not that much informed before this panel, before this whole talk. The next steps, because I feel like when I talk to the people back home at the borders, the Tory Times team, for example, everyone is now, it has been since November, it's already March now. As time passes, normal life activities will start coming in, jobs, people have to go back to their farms to take care of those and all that. I don't see the government taking these farm laws back, but how long we can go, and if we can go that long, I mean, what are the steps, like how we can make it this more forceful or more strong movement? Like I feel I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, to be very honest, and it's very disheartening and very depressing, but I just wanted to take what you guys feel about it and what's your take on it.
I mean, should we take a bunch or should we just answer them one by one, Kavita? What do you think is best? Should we just?
I would say I would love to hear everyone's response, but maybe one by one will be more efficient. But if you do ultimately want to add something, by all means, add something.
Right. No, I just mean that maybe the person asking the question can direct who they want to ask it to, or should we all just sort of respond to all of them?
Oh, yeah, that would be actually a great idea. If the people asking questions can direct it to a specific person, that would make it easier.
And then we can maybe get 2 or 3 at the same time, or however you want to do it. But I just have some maybe quick thoughts if we want to kind of maybe do it for the next one. I think this is a very important question. Harbani, thanks for sharing it. And I'd actually, maybe on another occasion, hear your experiences from the front lines. Look, it's called struggle for a reason, right? It is a struggle. It's going to have setbacks. It's going to be a slog. It's going to be, all sorts of betrayals and challenges, and where you're fighting a very determined and vicious adversary. So, we have to kind of bear that in mind. And our people have engaged in struggle before, so we should have that steadfast determination. When the call for Delhi Chalo happened in November, they actually said we are going to bring 6 months of supplies with us. And it wasn't a joke. People knew that it was going to be a long struggle. It's not something sort of heroic and sort of, quick. It's actually going to, go on for a long time. And the unions have made those arrangements, food, but also shelter and drinking water and sanitation and an incredible sort of atmosphere at these, encampments has sprung up. That's actually, probably more democratic than anything that has ever happened in the Lok Sabha is happening on the borders of Delhi. So the unions have made arrangements for it to last longer. I think there are degrees of escalation, and people are actively contemplating these things on the ground, how far and how much to push, because at the end of the day, you want to extract concessions from a government. So these are what those leaders and other people are kind of figuring out. Does one block another road? Does one block railway stations? Do you block the airport? Do you march in this direction or that direction? The elections are coming up in Bengal and Assam, and there's sort of moves to kind of try to affect the BJP fortunes there. So there's actually a whole host of actions on the table, and people are doing the very serious work of thinking through them, and they're not all on the same page. There's all sorts of divisions. So I think we ought to have, on the one hand, patience and a bit of trust in the kind of people on the front lines there as they're figuring this out. I think those of us out here that want to support the movement absolutely have to take seriously the politics of escalation and don't let up and don't wane. It's not a kind of flash in the pan. And in every sort of small, medium city and large city in the US, there are protests. There are people getting together and trying to figure out what to do. Plug into those groups and keep this momentum going. I think that international solidarity actually has a role to play in this, and if we don't expect those people to let up on the front lines, then we can't let up here.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize that dismantling any system takes time, and it takes dismantling a lot of very deep-seated power structures. So this is going to take time. And I think that as Navyug was saying, that our role in the diaspora is not necessarily to dictate policy. Otherwise, we're going to be doing exactly what the Modi government did, right? They dictated a policy without consulting the actual individuals who are impacted by it. But our role in the diaspora is really to continue having these conversations and having critical discourse, and really continuing to show support, because we need to recognize that I think that there's a certain sentiment of just like people get tired and it'll blow over, and we can't let that happen.
I think there's a tremendous opportunity for mobilization. As we've pointed out during this conversation, that there's really so many global issues that are implicated, whether it's ecological disaster, human rights, food security, internet freedom, freedom of the press, and these are all areas in which there are a lot of people that are working on individually and within their respective communities and organizations. And I think it's a matter of kind of